Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Passages Pulse. My name is Josiah McGee. I'm here this week without my usual co-host, Sebastian, who is still spending some time away with a new baby. Congratulations to Sebastian and his wife. But I do have a very special guest here with me today who I'll introduce in a moment. Today is Thursday, January 15, 2026. We're recording a bit outside of our usual cadence, actually, but because there is a very important subject on the docket. I do want to give a brief disclaimer as well. I am currently sick with a cold, so if I sound a little funny, I do apologize, but this is a very important episode, so I wanted to make sure that we've made time for this, and I'll do my best to make it through this without coughing or being too disruptive. First, a bit of background about the subject itself and why it is so important. Over the last couple of weeks, historic protests have broken out in Iran. Both the size of the protest and the brutality in response have, frankly, been a bit shocking and out of the norm. Unfortunately, the regime in Iran has cut off the internet, also making it very difficult to get accurate information about what is happening there. Today, however, we are very fortunate to be joined by someone who can give us some real information, given how difficult it is to actually learn about what's happening in Iran right now. My guest is a research analyst, and I do apologize. I should have asked before we started how to pronounce your name correctly. Would you mind saying your name for me real quick, and then I'll give your bio and intro to our audience?
Sure. It's great to be with you. My name is Janatan Sayeh. I'm the Iran Research Analyst at FDD, and I'm really excited to get into the conversation with you and your audience.
Amazing. Thank you so much. A bit more about your background, because I think our audience is really going to love hearing from you. As he said, he's the Iran Research Analyst at FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Previously, he was also a research lead at the International Republican Institute. He has also contributed to Iran policy research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the American Enterprise Institute. So quite the background in the think tank world in DC. He also, I think this is very important for our conversation, was born and raised in Tehran, as well as studied Hebrew and Arabic at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and holds a BA in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for joining us. I'm very excited to have both your expertise and your lived experience available to us for today's conversation. It's going to add, I think, a lot of very valuable insights. So thank you for being here today.
Pleasure. Thank you for covering this important issue in a timely manner.
Well, I'm going to stop talking and ask you to do most of the talking from here on out. But just to tee you up with the first question, for those who are unfamiliar, I think the current regime in Iran came to power during the Islamic Revolution of 1979. I think most of our audience probably knows that. But could you please explain for those who are less familiar the ideology or key features of the Islamic Revolution and how it's shaped the way that Iran is currently governed?
So that was really a turning point for the region. You're talking about, it was still technically the Cold War era. So the different factions that contributed to the revolution were predominantly led by Islamists, even though a significant portion was still leftist groups backed by the USSR. And that's the only thing that they really converged over, was the fact that they wanted at the time, the Shah, the king, gone. It's very important to note that even though there were different factions that contributed to the revolution, and there were, of course, foreign elements involved in that as well, the foreign service intelligence apparatus contributed to that, but ultimately it was the Islamists that had the ability to take over after the revolution. And it was really founded on different pillars, but the main theme of the Islamic Revolution was to ensure that they can replace an Iranian national identity with an Islamist identity. And a key feature of the 1979 revolution is that it was not only limited to Iran. So Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the revolution, explicitly said that this starts in Iran but doesn't end in Iran, which means they want to export the revolution. And that's what we've seen with the Islamic Republic, especially in recent years. When we talk about how the regime funds different militias abroad, is based on that ideology that goes beyond Iran. And how that's impacted Iranian society, of course, it's a rigorous enforcement of Islamist values onto the population that are no longer receptive to them, as we've seen with the recent protest wave. But nonetheless, the penal code and all the laws now based on Sharia law, which, of course, you see horrific human rights violations that are, again, directly inspired by Islamist law. For example, alcohol, of course, is banned, and women, of course, have to wear mandatory covering. And the punishments for those are quite heinous. So anything such as quote unquote waging war against Allah or God in this case, you may have been protesting on the street. And again, they use an Islamic penal code to say you are waging war against Allah, and that is punishable by execution. And Iran, unfortunately, now it's the highest executioner per capita, about 1,000 people a year, only second to China. But again, per capita is the highest based on the Islamic penal code. And sometimes, unfortunately, these punishments get a lot more gruesome. Again, I don't mean to be too graphic, but for example, people have been lashed for drinking alcohol. Horrific stuff happens to detainees, women who don't wear the hijab. We saw in 2022, a woman was effectively beaten to death because her head covering wasn't sufficient enough. It's not like she wasn't even wearing it, and she was beaten to death. And again, these are all not rogue elements of the regime. These are part of the institutions inspired by religion. So you really notice that firsthand. But increasingly, Iranian society has been rejecting that, trying to pivot away from that form of really medieval Islamism that doesn't really define the Iranian identity. And we can get to that later, but there's a big distinction as to what it means to be Iranian and what it means to only abide by Islamic values. So Iran has a really, really rich history, goes back 2,500 years. The language is not Arabic, it's Persian. Persian poetry, culture really is distinct in the region. And of course, the regime tries to replace that with an Islamic identity, and increasingly people are rejecting it.
One of the things I thought was so interesting about the Islamic Revolution of 1979 is that it was based on everything that you just said, but struggling to find some popularity. It seems like, at least based on the research that I've done, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a bit of a turning point where the the supreme leader was able to make the argument essentially that Islamism could be married with anti-imperialism. And it was after he married it with this idea of anti-imperialism that it really became very popular and was able to gain some street support, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And I assume that's where you find this regime coming into most direct conflict, or the reason why it continues to come into direct conflict with countries like the United States, for example. Is that a fair assessment?
It's very accurate, and thank you for pointing to that. I guess I was mostly focused on the effects of it on Iranian society, but to really talk about the ideology of the revolution, it was inherently founded on Islamizing Iran in order to wage war against specifically America, the West, Israel, Europe. When I say the West, I really mean they had chance of death to England, death to Israel, death to America. And yes, the foundation of the revolution sincerely believes that effectively certain leftist ideals are the sword that Islamists can use. And we know the famous quote, or the sword that Islamists can use to really wage war. It is, and when you talk about what is really inherent to the Islamic Republic, let's say we were to reform it, what are the things that could not be replaced? Being anti-American is essential. And of course, having internal Islamic values such as enforcing hijab on women. So domestically and externally, they're both intertwined, meaning this regime cannot change certain pillars unless there's an absolute regime collapse. It is foundation to it. And we see that in their foreign policy as well. Oftentimes, Islamic Republic officials try to exploit and capitalize on progressive causes in America. For example, the pro-Palestine riots here were all funded by the Islamic Republic. But on the other hand, you don't really see them capitalizing or exploiting conservative causes. It leans more towards the leftist aspect of things. And, these are two ideologies that often reinforce each other. They feed off of each other. But what's really bizarre is that those leftist values sometimes that the Islamic Republic tries to exploit to destabilize the West, oftentimes they're not tolerated under the Islamic Republic themselves. So that is this contradiction at times that people like to point out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd love for you maybe to explain a little bit more about what it's like actually living under this regime, because I think that's important context as far as why people are taking to the streets and engaging in these protests. The lived experience is something that's very hard for us to understand in our relatively comfortable Western bubble, I'm afraid. You grew up in Tehran, as you've shared with me, and have some firsthand experience living under the regime, the Islamic Republic. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is like? And I know you as well you're also Jewish, happen to be from Jewish background as well. So as a minority, especially living under this Islamic system, of which there are many minorities in Iran, what is that kind of experience actually like?
So I was also politically active. I moved to the States as a young adult, but I was really active during the 2009 Green Movement is what it was called. Briefly, I want to just talk about the trajectory of anti-Islamist movements from my own experience. So at that time in 2009, it was one of the first waves that we saw of a movement against the Islamic Republic. And the thing about that wave was there were still hopes of reforms within the system, meaning maybe there were avenues where we could maybe improve the Islamic Republic, whether it was social issues or whether it was economic issues. That was quickly shattered. And that's because of that, increasingly Iranian civil society, Iranian youth are moving away from reform, and the demands are now explicit regime change. I think that was the biggest, really societal switch, if you will, ideologically speaking. But speaking from my own experience, I can tell you there's quite a contrast between regime officials and supporters and ordinary Iranians. It is increasingly more so, it is black and white. There's no real gray area that you might be a sympathizer, but not really. That is not as much of a case anymore. And of course, growing up Jewish, you notice the systemic persecution of religious minorities, but it never comes from civil society. It never comes from your peers or your neighbors. It's always through state institutions. It's always through schools that are public, or even if they're private, they're still controlled by the state, given that it's a totalitarian theocracy. Or with the penal code, like I mentioned. Another good example is that legally speaking, is much more easier to confiscate your property if you're a religious minority. But to dive into that a little bit more, perhaps Christian converts are the most persecuted. According to the Islamic Republic Penal Code, anyone who converts out of Islam, easily punishable by death. And of course, Iran has one of the highest numbers of converts to Christianity, especially up in the north. And that is the most crackdown on communities, excuse me. Because you have historically Christian communities living in Iran, such as Armenians or Assyrians that have been, I guess, generationally Christian. Even though the persecution against them exists, it is not necessarily punishable by death. What they do oftentimes with Christians and Jews and the Baha'i faith, you get accused of espionage. If, let's say, there's times of unrest, such as during the 12-day war in June, when Israel attacked the Islamic Republic's military sites, the regime immediately pointed fingers at the religious minorities. They interrogated Christians, they interrogated Jews. So, of course, they're always on the front lines. But even the prospects of, let's say, a person who was of Muslim descent that wants to convert to Christianity, I think there are even cases of them getting executed, or the priests that are the pastors that are conducting these, again, they get executed. So it is really ingrained in Islamic Republic's policies. But when you talk about the society, it's not even a part of conversation, really. It's not even about, like, growing up there. I had friends who were Christians. I had friends that were, Jews, Baha'i, Muslims, atheists. That was not part of the conversation. We were friends, and I guess we loved each other, and our identity was Iranian first, and religion came after, if at all. But this is really important for young people, especially in the West, to realize that when we talk about the regime, there is a clear separation between the society and the Islamic Republic. Iran is majority young. Women outnumber men in universities. The society is inherently anti-Islamist. Not to say they're anti-Muslim. The idea is that you can, according to the society, you can practice whatever religion you'd like. But once you start governing through that and using that as an excuse to crack down on people and assassinate and murder and behead and torture, then that's when society takes issue with it. So there is this is all to say, yes, persecution does exist, but again, it doesn't stem from society.
Before we get into the protests, and thank you for sharing that, I think that is an important distinction. But before we get into the protests, I think one other thing I would love it if you could touch on briefly. You said it used to be concern about reform. Now it's more call for regime change, maybe a difference between the protests that you participated in and the current set of protests. What changed exactly? Can you expound on what about the conditions in Iran, politically, socially, whatever it may be, changed in such a way that the end goal of the protests changed to that degree?
To quickly put in perspective, last 10 years have been the most turbulent, starting in 2016, 17, 2016, up until 2025 now, and 2026, of course. As I mentioned, 2009 was the start for younger millennials. But again, once that was cracked down on, we saw a little bit of space until it reemerged in 2016. In 2009, like I mentioned, the idea was we can reform the system. We were backing, or not we, but like the protest movement was to an extent backing elements within the regime that were seen as reformists as opposed to hardliners. Now we all know it was always a sham, and it was always about the Islamic Republic having a controlled opposition so they don't have to really meaningfully give in. But once that was shattered, that took a few years for Iranians to mobilize and really gather their thoughts as to, okay, how do we proceed? How do we proceed? And I think nationalism quickly stepped in. So in the past 10 years, we've seen the protests to have a more increasingly nationalist sentiment, but we have to talk about what triggered every protest wave. So again, we talked about 2009, that had a political trigger. It was because of reform. There was demands of reform within the system. That got crushed. Then you had 2017, mostly economic. 2017, again, nationwide protest. The trigger was economic. Again, the demands were about death to the dictator, meaning the Ayatollah, and um, death to the Islamic Republic's ideology. We saw that again in 2019, once the gasoline prices surged, fuel prices surged. That was the first time that we saw total internet shutdown, and that's when the security forces killed about 2,000 protesters within just a couple of days in total darkness. But a couple of years later, we saw different triggers for protests. The other one was environmental. So because of the regime's mismanagement paired with climate change, but the Islamic Republic's mismanagement that we can get into a little bit later has really exacerbated the ongoing environmental crisis in Iran. They build unstandardized dams. They fund these mega projects because of the kleptocracy. They fund these mega projects that don't need to be done at the expense of the environment. There is no preventative measures like cloud seeding or anything like that. There's no really management on that front. Because of the over extraction of water reserves, we see land subsidence and we see major cities crumbling, infrastructure collapsing. That led to another wave of protests. At the time, it was a bit more rural areas. Farmers that were facing droughts were protesting, but then that expanded to the cities as well because I talked about the infrastructure collapse. Then in 2022, we saw a social trigger for the environment. Social trigger for the protests, which was, as I quickly touched on, the killing of a woman who was not wearing the proper version of a headscarf. She was beaten to death. And that led to protest waves, the quote-unquote women life freedom movement in 2022. So in each step of the way, we've seen different triggers for the unrest in Iran, but ultimately it was always led to demands for regime change. They want the regime gone. And that is because they exhausted all options. The reform didn't work. Appealing to the Islamic Republic did not work. And now, where we're headed right now is Iranians are increasingly calling for the return of the Pahlavi dynasty. The Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, whom his father was ousted in the 1979 revolution, he has been the leading opposition figure and the only viable option. And that's what young people are looking to the most. Because again, they look at a prosperous Iran prior to the Islamic Revolution. Currency was doing really well. Environment was great. Iranian passport was really strong. So the demands have even gone beyond regime change. And Iranians have effectively decided what they want as the alternative. They had it in place. And again, the monarchy within the Iranian context is inherently a legitimate form of government, whether it is an absolute monarchy or constitutional monarchy, similar to what we see in Europe. And that was the case throughout many years in the Iranian political context. That was actually constitutional monarchy, the parliament having more vote, more of a say in how things are conducted. So ultimately, it would have to come down to elections after regime change. We can get into that a little bit later. But as to what Iranians would want to have, the Crown Prince right now has been very active, specifically leading a transition away from the Islamic Republic so we can bring about fair elections, hopefully with international monitoring, for them to decide their form of government.
So let's touch on the trigger for this specific set of protests. You named the trigger for most of the previous rounds of protests. I've heard mixed stories, some contradictions about what actually led to or precipitated these protests that have been going on for, I think it's about 2 weeks now, maybe a little bit more, maybe.
3, yeah.
What led to these, and what can you tell us about how these protests are organized, and what should we know about these protests?
This immediate trigger for these were similarly economic. Once the rial collapsed against the American dollar, that has been happening. So the rial has been plunging really lower and lower, the Iranian currency, which means inflation is on the rise. So inflation was about, I think, 40% month to month, meaning sometimes certain items were actually saw an increase of 70% within a few months, but that was as high as it got. But really, the purchase power is really, really low. And because of rampant corruption and kleptocracy, the select group of people, the Islamists in charge, are now exploiting all these natural resources that are, Iranian oil exports and non-oil exports as well, effectively. But it's very important that we don't call these economic protests because the demands are not economic. There are no demands of economic reform. More importantly, there's no mention of U.S. sanctions. Contrary to what some propagandists might say, Iranians do not see America or U.S. sanctions in any way responsible. They see their leadership as responsible. That's very important we take in mind. And of course, the demands inherently regime change. But to take a step back as to what led to this moment, there were other factors that were building up. This year, the environmental crisis was at its worst.
Mm,
And
yeah.
that was coupled with electricity and power outages. On top of that, executions were surging this year as well, about 1,000. Paired with the fact that following the 12-day war, Islamic Republic arrested 21,000 people for simply posting online. So it was really a range of factors, but the economic trigger led to this protest movement that has entered week 3.
So I want to ask you a fairly blunt question. How do we tell what's true and what's not? And the question behind my question, I suppose, or the reasoning is I'm seeing reports every day that are absolutely horrific. The photos, the videos of the streets, the morgues, the hospitals just filled with bodies. And it's hard to know what's true and what's not. You know, are the protests violent or not? If they are, what are they targeting? Is the regime actively targeting civilians or not? How high is the death toll actually? Because I've heard numbers everywhere from 2,000 to 16,000. I mean, just this massive range of numbers of casualties of these protests and
Yeah.
scope of regime brutality. Do you know, like, what's the real story and how do we find the real story? I guess I would also love to know, like, where do you get your information so we can figure out how to get accurate information about this?
So ultimately, I guess since there's still an internet blackout, it would be challenging for us to know the exact details, but we can have a more accurate range than starting from 2 to 12,000.
Hmm.
To put in perspective, I mentioned 2019, and that's when they killed about 1,500 people within 48 hours. And that was established. Reuters reported on it, Human Rights Outlet reported on it, and this was years ago. So it was fact-checked, corroborated. We know that for a fact. The threat against the Islamic Republic was not nearly as existential as it is right now. They think this is a battle that if they lose, they're going to be effectively taken over. So to them, this is existential. Couple that with what the judiciary said. Judiciary officially announced that we will show you no mercy, and we will continue to crack down and praise law enforcement's capacity to crack down. Meaning the regime that we said kills about like 1,000 people, like the highest executioner per capita, the worst tortures in jail, is officially announcing that they're even going to be worse about it. So again, sometimes maybe you have to take their word for it if they tell you they're going to be more brutal. In addition to that, another thing that was verified, and again, it's not about speculation, is how the Islamic Republic deployed terrorist proxies. So proxies from Iraq, from Lebanon, realistically from Afghanistan as well. And these are armed militias that were fighting against Americans. So they've only experienced in terrorism, warfare, asymmetrical warfare, not crowd control. If a regime relies on such an entity to come murder protesters, again, it signals to a really high death toll. Another thing you have to look at the videos used. In the videos, what weapons are used. And these are automatic weapons. These are not rubber bullets. These are not even shotguns that from a distance, it might not kill you. These are AK-47s automatic. These are artilleries. I've seen dushkas that they install in the back of a pickup truck and they effectively open fire on the masses. So you see the videos, you see how they deploy terrorist proxies. They tell you they're cracking down even harder. It is existential to them. And in the past, when they shut down the internet, as they did right now, in 2 days, they killed 2,000 people. If you look at all of it together, before we even have to look at the numbers after the internet is, freed, if you look at it all together, it does point to a higher death count than 2,000, without a doubt. So it's been going on like the internet outage has been happening about a week now. In 2 days, internet outage, they killed 2,000. Realistically, this time it has to be a lot more. As to whether they would actually open fire on protesters or not, there are videos of it. So there's no doubt about whether they killed. There's no doubt as to whether it's been 1,000 or 2,000. It's just how much more is it? So where does it end with them? And I know for a fact that crackdowns haven't stopped because the internet is still out. So if a regime was in control, they would love to reinstall the internet and put out propaganda videos. They're not doing any of that, which tells you crackdowns are ongoing. We get reports from the ground. People are still protesting. And given that it's existential to them, it is very likely that the numbers are in the high thousands.
Wow. So I think one of the things that's been particularly interesting about the reporting in the West about these protests is a lot of people, of course, horrified by the violence and the cruelty of the reaction to the protests, and admiration, I think, for the courage of the protesters as well. But at the same time, some skepticism about, okay, is it going to be different this time? I mean, there's been many rounds of protests, as you've already sort of mapped out for us. Are these going to succeed? Are these going to be crushed the same way that the previous ones were, especially if the regime is willing to do whatever it takes to survive? I mean, what do you expect to be the outcome of these protests, realistically?
Yeah, so the protest started on a Sunday, and we saw crowds come out. The crowds, kept getting larger, and they're expanding. But there was a turning point on that Thursday after that Sunday. This is 3 weeks ago, where the crown prince called on everyone as an opposition figure to come out and protest, and we saw a surge in numbers, and that's when they shut down the internet. That's what really terrified them. Shortly after, President Trump said, "Keep protesting, help is on the way," and we heard that like 2, 3 times after that. So what really gave this momentum even more strength was international support, because you're talking about unarmed protesters, civilians. These are people I grew up with. I know them. They're not rebels. This is not a civil war like Syria. These are just day-to-day normal people that they just want a better life for themselves. They're not armed. Very limited factions on the countryside that are separatist groups might be armed, but the majority in major cities, definitely not armed, definitely not radical, by no means are Islamists. That's why I think they were really hopeful that there would be international support. And I think that would be the key differentiator here. If there is no backing of coming from America or even Israel, like we saw in earlier waves, it is likely going to get crushed again. Because on one side, they're opening fire on unarmed people. On one hand, they can, Iranians haven't been deterred so far, but effectively they've been killed in such significant numbers that they just can't go and protest again because they've either been killed or their family member was killed. So that's why it's really crucial that Washington backs up its threats with action. Otherwise, it risks losing the momentum, pushing a delegitimate Islamist regime towards its collapse. And that is a point of no return, really. So if this wave were to get crushed, the crackdown afterwards would be nothing like we've seen before. And I think, again, the administration is still contemplating a response. But I can tell you, I've heard from people personally. They told me that they're going out because President Trump said that he would back them up. And as for the internet outage, for the most part, it's complete blackout. Starlink is jammed, but we do get occasional connections from people. So for example, my friends were able to use a certain kind of VPN that then again rerouted them, used more than once internet circumvention tool. We were able to talk for maybe 30 minutes before that was also shut down. So again, the regime is actively trying. So we do here and there get some information out that tells us the movement is going and the killing is serious. And the intention behind this movement is to overthrow the regime. And we hear increasingly call from these protesters that they're calling for support from the international community, from President Trump, to come and actually level the playing field against this murderous regime.
One of the nuances I've seen that is an interesting story yet to unfold is, if the regime falls, would it be total collapse? Would it be some kind of military autocracy? Let's pretend, for example, that the the easiest path to removing the Islamists is to put Iran's national army in charge, which is somewhat distinct as an entity from institutions like the IRGC or the Revolutionary Guard. That's one path to ending the regime, is replacing it with the military regime. Another path would be, as you mentioned, perhaps the Shah returning and holding elections to re-establish a parliament, a constitutional monarchy of some kind, that sort of thing. What do you think is more likely? I mean, what would be the more likely outcome of a collapse of the current regime in terms of what the next steps or next day after would look like for Iran?
It would inherently depend on whether and how America would react. So if, let's say, there was a limited strike only from America, meaning wouldn't go after the entire apparatus, let's say only went after the supreme leader, for example. If, let's say, they decapitated the supreme leader and only a few officials, similar to Venezuela's situation, and they wanted to leverage existing people within or the regime, then it would look like probably a form of situation where probably the IRGC elements, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps elements, would take over. I don't see that being that plausible, because it wouldn't really solve the problem for us, for America. People wouldn't want that, so there would still be protests going on even afterwards. So the most realistic scenario here is an attack that would, of course, go beyond just decapitation, that would be in coordination with the people, that would enable them to really take control of their own destiny, go after these armed personnel one by one. So once you decapitate the top leadership, the middle command, officers, and then the foot soldiers would have to then make a decision. If they know there's no escape, if they know they cannot escape to Moscow or Venezuela, they know they have to face the people that makes them much more likely to defect, given that there's a defection program. And if we were to go down that route and really leverage Iranian nationalism through the crown prince, that would also ensure that Iran wouldn't turn into a failed state. It would not turn into a fragmented nation like Syria is right now. Again, the national identity is strong, and the only way that you can ensure that Iran, again, stays unified, meaning there's going to be no separatists, and stays out of terrorism and doesn't pose a threat, whether it's through terrorism or through ballistic missiles or through nuclear, the only viable option is going through the crown prince. Now, if the US decides not to do anything, which is the third option, then effectively we would just see this regime crack down, and we would see an even more intense form of repression from the Islamic Republic. So we have three options: maximum strike, limited strike, and no action. And effective coordinated maximum strike would be the best outcome, leveraging an opposition who's demonstrated that he can bring people to the street, who believes in Western values, who's anti-Islamist, and who's been very clear that he wants to only lead a transition and not to be a quote-unquote dictator.
Okay. Well, I think that answers my question about what your preferred solution is. So I'll ask you a different question instead as my last question. Where would you recommend that those listening to this podcast continue to find good, reliable information about the protests? Are there any sources you recommend reading, listening to? What would you suggest?
What really surprised me about this protest wave was that I think conservative outlets were more likely to cover it than more traditionally, I guess, liberal or progressive outlets. I do think there's this bizarre sentiment that was propagated by the Islamic Republic that somehow this recent protest wave is a coup by America and the Mossad, and it is not an organic movement. So instead of really pointing out where to look for it, I can tell you what not to look for and what would really be a buzzword that you can know that this outlet realistically is not going to give you accurate information is if they in any way say, oh, Iranians do not want intervention. That's one keyword. Iranians absolutely need intervention. They've been demanding it because, again, it's an uneven playing field. And we're not talking about boots on the ground. We're not talking about Iraq, Afghanistan stuff. We're simply saying level the playing field so Iranians can define their own destiny as the Middle East's only anti-Islamist civic movement. Another theme would be, again, if someone is trying to downplay the murders and say they didn't happen, similar to what the foreign minister was saying. Foreign minister was on Fox News and said there was absolutely no killings. Anything echoing that, despite all the evidence, again, is probably playing into that regime narrative. I guess another disinformation is, like I said, is if they're trying to delegitimize the protesters, saying these are non-Iranian or these are a minority, realistically nothing's happening in Iran. So I would really look out for these buzzwords, and that should tell you where things are headed. But ultimately, we live in an era where the issue is not limited information, it's too much information, meaning there's so much disinfo and misinformation and propaganda out there. Given that Iranians are facing an internet shutdown, they cannot be their own voice. So unfortunately, we have a responsibility here to echo what they're saying. I wish I could give you more detail, but it's such a fluid movement right now. It's really challenging to pinpoint exact outlets or things that are covering it. Is more so you need to know what not to look out for.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that. It's a very, very complex environment, and I think it's good to know what is misinformation and how to spot that. I think if you can spot the counterfeit, then that helps you filter through more quickly and find what you are looking for. You're actually looking for. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy, obviously. You must be, given what's going on right now, and really appreciate you coming on to share your thoughts with us, your insights and your opinions as well. Thank you, Lindsay, as well, our producer in the background, for helping make this episode happen. And thank you as well to the listeners, our audience. We really appreciate you guys jumping on and making time for this conversation. I think it's critical. There's some really brutal things happening right now, but it's important for us, I think, as Christians, not to look away, but to be aware, sober-minded, prayerful about current events around the world. And so we appreciate you taking the time for this conversation as well. And we will see you all next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.